All right, let's get into it. Let's talk about quarterbacks real quick, Chris. I think one of the things is with quarterbacks is it's tough, right? Because you got to differentiate between single QB leagues and Superflex leagues. And I think that Superflex leagues have now kind of elevated where quarterbacks go in the draft. Also, the fact that we used to play in 6 point per passing touchdown, that has elevated things. But then you get Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen as type players, and that elevates things too. So there's been a premium on the premium quarterback, which may or may not, depending on who you ask, may have shifted some of the rankings for the other quarterbacks behind them. Talk to me about when you're, those elite quarterbacks. Do you think those are worth taking in like first, second, third rounds? Like, talk to me just about your quarterback strategy when it comes to the elite guys.
Sure. And elite, I agree with you, Justin, that the elite guys are the ones that are going to be able to provide you with that mobility, whether it's through the design run game. So like you were talking earlier, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, guys that are going to have those rushing carries that are going to be so potent for them, especially around the goal line, or even when it's like third and long, something along those lines, they're going to be a part of that. The defenses are going to have to account for their legs. But also, you've got the scramblers. I mean, guys that while they are going to drop back to pass, they wind up using their legs in order to create afterwards. So even guys from Bo Nix, Brock Purdy, those types of guys that can still create with their legs as well, I would put them in that similar category because rushing production is rushing production. It doesn't matter how it comes. I mean, of course, we would want the designed rushing plays because those are a bit more reliable than scrambles. But still, if you know that a guy has that mobility to his game, I would push them farther up. And now from a draft strategy standpoint, I've actually done a couple of studies. If you guys want to check out some of my work over at fantasylife.com, one of the pieces that actually just dropped maybe within the last like half hour or so was my draft strategy article about drafting from the 101. And where I used some data from best ball rosters. And of course, I know that best ball is different from your managed leagues, but just looking at how most drafters wind up approaching the quarterback position and looking at roster construction, most folks were drafting quarterbacks or tight ends, like the onesie positions. They were drafting quarterbacks in the first 6 rounds at about 44%. Like that's all across all of the playoff teams that went into the Best Ball Mania tournament that Underdog has. So about 44% of the teams drafted at least one quarterback or one tight end early. And so I'm looking at that and thinking, well, okay, how early was it? Is it first round, second round? Well, no, because those are more where you'll find the elite running backs and wide receivers. So everybody from your Saquon Barkleys, your Bijan Robinsons, your Jamar Chases, all the way down into like the second and third round where guys like T. Higgins, Tyreek Hill, those types of guys go. You're very hard pressed to be able to find the same level of production at wide receiver and running back later on in the draft. So that's why you'll see Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Jaden Daniels. Those guys will come in the third round where the amount of replaceable production starts to settle out a bit. The wide receivers and running backs available in the third, fourth, fifth round kind of flattens out. Like it doesn't really matter if I'm going to wind up getting, let's say, Devonta Smith versus, I don't know, like Lad McConkey. I'm not like trying to compare them. Just looking at their week-to-week output. So if those guys are like now who I'm going to compare against, well, I can take a quick detour and grab Lamar Jackson or Joe Burrow or Bo Nix or whomever, those types of guys that I know are going to be week in and week out, top 5, top 6 starters. And so that's really like typically been my approach to quarterbacks is being able to grab those guys in the around 4th-ish round after being able to draft at least maybe one running back or high-end running back, 2 solid wide receivers or some combination of the two, and then trying to target the quarterbacks around, like I said, around the 4th round or so.
Yeah, because you see it in a lot of drafts, I think, and I kind of alluded to it, like quarterback being pushed up, right? It feels like because those guys are 400-point scorers that you have to take them earlier. You got to take Lamar in a 3rd round. You got to take Josh Allen in the 3rd round because quarterbacks matter, and that's what's been preached. But there's so much value this year, especially at the top. There's a lot of elite talent that's kind of falling down into drafts. And, we're getting guys in the 2nd, 3rd round. Tyreek Hill sometimes goes in the back end of the 2nd, top end of the 3rd round, just elite talented players that you can find. So I think one of the things for me is looking at, okay, what's the value over the replacement? So if I'm in the 3rd round and Lamar has been taken and Josh Allen's been taken, I still see Jalen Hurts there. I still see Jaden Daniels there. I still see Patrick Mahomes and Joe Burrow there. So I'm not as hard pressed to take a quarterback. And I think it matters your league size, right? Like if it's an 8-team league or a 10-team league or a 12-team league, you might have more positional advantage either in a really a shallow league or maybe in a 14, 16 team league, now you need that positional advantage just a little bit more. So in your 10 team or 12 team league where there's still viable talent on the waivers, I find myself waiting a little bit, especially, Chris, when we talk about like these middle round quarterbacks, right? Like you start getting into this tier of, we know they're probably not going to be the quarterback 1, but there's a bunch of guys that could be like the quarterback 5, a top 5-ish quarterback. You mentioned Brock Purdy or like Jared Goff, Jordan Love. You start talking even earlier than that, Bo Nix, Kyler Murray. Like, talk to me about your strategy for middle round quarterbacks. What are you looking at in that range?
So if I'm going to at least adjust my draft strategy, like as the early rounds start to unfold, and it's like, well, I'm not going to be able to get my Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, the board just doesn't fall my way. Well, then it behooves me to start filling in my core spots. So when I say core positions, I mean running backs and wide receivers, because we start more of them. It's at least 2 running backs and 2 wide receivers, 3 depending on which platform you're using. So if I have to start most of those guys, I don't want to have to worry about them and my quarterback, right? I don't want to have a weak roster from that standpoint, then also have to rely on Justin Herbert or, like you said, Jordan Love, Dak Prescott to really get my team over the hump. So I'm loading up on the other positions, maybe take a detour and grab me a Trey McBride or whichever elite, George Kittle or whomever in the early rounds. And then afterwards, it becomes less of a requirement that the quarterback that I do take has to have that like top 5 ceiling. Of course you want that, right? Like you want to be able to get the guy that is undervalued. So like you're saying earlier, I think Dak Prescott is a little undervalued this season, just looking at the weapons around him, how pass heavy they could potentially be under Brian Schottenheimer, so on and so forth. He's just an example, a name. But if I think that he has the potential to hop up into that top 5, top 6 echelon, then of course I want that upside, but at the very least the floor is there. I don't have to worry about, as I have less pressure on me in order to have that high-end quarterback when everything else is set. My running backs are set. My wide receivers are set. I probably got a decent tight end as well. And if I can just drop that quarterback into him, then onto the roster, then all of my problems are solved. And at least it gives me a shot versus if I were to do it the other way and say that, well, I'm going to take this, I'm going to like try and build it a different way and just get a bunch of running backs and maybe a couple of wide receivers here and not thinking about that positional scarcity. And now I have the handicap of, let's say, a Justin Fields, who I think is also potentially undervalued as well, but it doesn't have that same high-end upside as some of the other guys I'm talking about. And I have a little bit more uncertainty that puts a bit more pressure on me to make sure that everything on my roster is good before I wind up starting that quarterback that I just might not be in love with as much as the other guys. So that's typically how I approach like the mid-round guys.
And I kind of like that, though, because it's in the mid rounds too, where you're finding maybe those question marks. You've already built the team. So I think where I look for is like, if you take a quarterback early, I think one of the things you're securing is your floor, right? If you take Lamar Jackson, you're securing a 20 to 25 point floor on a weekly basis. Josh Allen, similar thing. What I like doing is kind of securing my floor with the other players involved, especially when you're in a 3 receiver in a flex type league where you have more depth needed. I like securing the floor there and then addressing, where can I find a guy that will potentially be this year's Jaden Daniels? Who can I find down low that potentially will massively outplay their spot? So I know even the concern with like a Justin Fields, right? Like potentially the floor isn't there. I do value the upside with a guy like him, or like a Dak Prescott or a Jordan Love, because now we're talking about potentially like a top 5 to 7 finish at the position. And so there is a little bit of risk there. And I think that's one thing I try to talk about on here is like risk tolerance too. This is where you start to get into like, how good are you at fantasy football? And like, how much do you trust your judgment, or how good are you at drafting to where you can pair that up with another pick in case it doesn't work out, in case Justin Fields is just trash, or in case Brock Purdy isn't the guy that he used to be. Like, now you can have another player. Do you draft a Jared Goff with that, or a Trevor Lawrence, or somebody else on the back end to pair that up?
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing right there. It's your own fantasy management style. And if you are more risk averse, then you might need to grab a Lamar Jackson, a Josh Allen, a set it and forget it type of player, so that you don't have to worry about that. You're going to essentially play gamble on your running backs and wide receivers and not have to worry about who your quarterback is going to be. But if you are more risk tolerant, then you might be able to say, well, I don't need to have Josh Allen. I can find Brock Purdy. I can find Drake May. I can find insert name here that's going to give me at least enough so that I'm within shooting distance of these other teams that have these elite quarterbacks. But oh, by the way, I've got Bijan Robinson, I've got Tyreek Hill, I've got, and you don't have to worry about all the rest of your roster because you just have this other quarterback that can at least get you close enough to the elite guys.
Right. Last point on quarterbacks though, because it's interesting to hear like different perspective, right? Everybody on my channel, we fade the quarterback, unfortunately. Like we're playing the waiting game. It just you'll see in the mock drafts, like we play the waiting game. But in Superflex is where I get probably the biggest pushback on waiting, right? Because typically you're told you need to take a quarterback in the first 2 rounds of a Superflex draft. Like you have to. What is your thought and your process on Superflex? I typically fade unless I'm getting, a late drop on Lamar or a late drop on a quarterback that I really like in the first 2 rounds. I'm kind of waiting and taking some of these middle round guys. How do you feel about Superflex? And talk to me about some of the numbers you got behind it.
So that would be a function of what your draft slot is, because it's almost similar to your managed league where you're comparing running backs and wide receivers by, let's say, if you were to draft a quarterback in a 1 QB league, if you were to draft a quarterback at, let's say, the 101 position, you are the opportunity cost that you're going to lose by not drafting Jamar Chase or Bijan Robinson and Saquon Barkley, those 300 plus fantasy points that you're going to get year in and year out. You're not going to find that in the second round. Now apply the 2 QB context to it. Whereas if you were to now take the guys that are going to be drafted in the first 5 picks, so those first 5 quarterbacks that are typically going 1 QB leagues, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, those guys, will you be able to find, if you wind up drafting them versus who's going to be available at QB 8, 9, 10, those guys that are going to get drafted closer to the back end of the first round, that might be a situation where, well, why don't I wind up grabbing Saquon Barkley? Why don't I grab Bijan Robinson? Because I can at least get my top-end quarterback in the second round after the turn. Yep. Or I can then wind up grabbing a second quarterback in the 4th round. And again, be able to fill out my other positions, the positions of need, with more elite talent. Because if you can wind up having a combination of, let's say, top end, let's say a top 10 quarterback versus a top 5 quarterback. So let's say you walk out with Bo Nix as your starting quarterback, but then also you have Bijan Robinson and you also have one of the top end wide receivers. That combination is much more potent than saying I have to have 2 quarterbacks early. And so that's where you draft at and how many quarterbacks go ahead of you can wind up at least forcing you to consider adjusting your strategy versus just adhering to I have to have 2 quarterbacks because everybody else is drafting 2 quarterbacks, especially this season where quarterback seems to be a little bit deeper than what I remember being in the past. A lot of bit deeper. Because if you have, let's say, Geno Smith going as quarterback 25, you have Michael Penix Jr., quarterback 23. There are multiple quarterbacks that can be available late. They might not sound as sexy as some of the other options that are available at quarterback 12, 13, 14. But if they are startable options, if they are guys that will get you, or at least have the potential to get hitting around 15, 17, 18 fantasy points, then again, we're also talking about that range where as long as the rest of your roster is in shape and you have high-end options at running back, wide receiver, and tight end, then the quarterback, you're not as reliant on that quarterback option as the teams that take the Josh Allens, Lamar Jacksons, and Joe Burrows.
Yeah, bro. Justin Fields and Stafford, or give me Dak and Cam Ward.
There you go.
A little upside and floor type play. You could do really well with quarterback this year. And I think in Superflex, it's just for whatever reason, I think there's been some kind of number that's come out that said, hey, the percentage of winners who win in Superflex have typically drafted their quarterbacks in this round. And it's kind of skewed things, in my opinion, because that was a previous year. That's a previous season. It's not always like that. So maybe there is some slight advantages to that. But for me, I think if you can find the top 5, if you can find a Jaden Daniels, if you can find the player who is going to outproduce their ADP, you're going to win that argument more times than not. So that's typically where I'm at on quarterback. But that does it for quarterbacks. Obviously, let us know what you guys think in the comments. Want to